Unfortunately, Professor Casanova's flight was canceled twice, and then he just gave up, and he's not coming. So we'll have only two speakers, Yaacov Yadgar and Adam Seligman. Each will speak for around 25 minutes, and will allow a few minutes for questions of precision and so on. And then after Professor Seligman finishes, I will introduce a broader discussion. Actually, I think that their papers complement one another, so it will be useful to have the discussion together. Professor Yadgar is the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Oxford. Unfortunately, we didn't meet there because I left just before he came. His research revolves around issues of political theology, nationalism, secularism, and tradition. His empirical work centers around Zionist ideology and Israeli theopolitics. His scholarship is multidisciplinary, encompassing Jewish, political, cultural, religious, and media studies. I will mention here only his two most recent books, Israel's Jewish Identity Crisis, State and Politics in the Middle East, Cambridge 2020, and Sovereign Jews, Israel, Zionism, and Judaism in 2017. Both these books revolve around the meaning of Jewish sovereignty for Israel. And I invite him to speak to us now on modernity, secularism, and tradition. Professor Yadgar.
Thank you, Professor Strubza, for this kind introduction, and I thank the Academy for the invitation. In an article published in 1973, Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt reflected critically on the academic field's failure to account for tradition in modern times. Too much of sociopolitical and anthropological research, he noted, is based on rigid notions of what modernity and traditions are. Sociological and political research, he observed, simply fails to account for tradition. Eisenstadt was writing against a background of general disregard of tradition in academic circles. Tradition is often seen as something that is, at best, of relevance only for understanding the past, surely lacking relevance for understanding the present or the future. To an extent, this sentiment has become foundational in the construction of the modern or Western self. This dismissal of tradition owes much to an Enlightenment-born sense of an inherent antinomy between tradition and individual sovereignty or liberty. This naturally leads also to an opposition between tradition and truth. This opposition has brought to life a conception of a human being or a mind who is detached from her past, at least potentially so. At a minimum, this rational, disengaged individual, the modern subject per se, is perceived to be sovereign in relation to her past. This conception of the disengaged subject or mind, again, and the implied antinomy between traditional knowledge and truth have been enshrined as foundational notions of true, real, modern science. The dominance of this scientific ideal might explain why Eisenstadt's call seems to have been left largely unheeded during the heyday of positivist behaviorism in the social sciences. Scholars tended to view tradition as a taken for granted, authoritatively unchallenged, and rather unambiguous element of the pre-modern or non-modern sociocultural setting. They view tradition as a restraint on individual liberty and rationality. To a large degree, this disregard and hostility towards tradition nourishes on a regrettable disciplinary schism, which separates the social sciences from the humanities, especially from philosophy. But philosophy both lies at the core of the positivist social sciences suspicion of tradition and offers some thoughtful alternative understandings of tradition such that can surely shed an illuminating light on the study of society. And so, in what follows, I wish to outline some of the basic tenets of an understanding of tradition based on a sociological reading, or so-called sociological reading, of several major philosophical works. At the core of this understanding of tradition is an emphasis on tradition's foundational or constitutive nature. Tradition is the infrastructure that both enables our self-understanding and sets its limit. Yet tradition is meaningless without its interpretation and application by individuals and communities, hence its dynamism. Our past is continuously formed and reformed. Tradition, in other words, both enables and limits our ability to comprehend reality, stressing our situatedness as a precondition of our very cognition. And it is, tradition itself, a reflection of present, contemporary understandings of the meaning of the past. Three corresponding imageries or analogies capture this complex nature of tradition. Tradition as language, tradition as narrative, and tradition as horizon. And I will follow these three imageries now. So let's start with tradition as language. Tradition is or can be viewed as a practical system of signification, much like language is a textual or verbal system of signification. A substructure of practice and meaning. It is the nurturing bed from within which we develop and through which we conduct ourselves as individuals and members of society. At the same time, this analogy also highlights the individual's role in maintaining tradition, underscoring the dialogical, although not equal, nature of our relation to tradition. To begin with, just as we do not choose the language into which we are born, so do we not choose the tradition into which we are born and through which we are shaped as individuals in our formative years. And this rather circumstantial fact carries heavy, decisive implications. For language is not just a medium or a tool of our thought, but the very precondition of one's ability to think. Meaning is, of course, the key issue here. Like language, tradition plays a major role in the social construction of reality, enabling us to understand everyday reality by giving us a vocabulary of meaning that transcends our immediate reality. The analogy to language also captures the silent, inevitable nature of tradition's hold on us. Tradition, like language, precedes us, not just chronologically, but also being the way that things are done in our sociocultural habitat, meaningfully, in setting the practical grammar through which and by which we develop as individuals. This analogy further highlights the historical and particularistic nature of this infrastructure, shedding a critical light on the universalistic pretense of rationalist notions of an independent, rational mind, freely examining reality by its use of the abstract rules of logic. Just as that inevitable foundation of our consciousness, language, is particularistic in nature, meaning it has a certain past, a certain way of viewing reality, and a certain way of describing it, a certain way of conducting one in her or his world, enabling us to express ourselves in certain ways and preventing us from doing so in other ways. So does tradition impose its practical grammar, if you like, on us. But as I hinted earlier, this emphasis of tradition's authority over us is far from being the whole story. For our ideological relation to tradition also means that tradition, again, much like language, is dependent on us. Us are its bearers for its interpretation, application, practice, and ultimately its very survival. Note that we commonly refer to languages that are no longer spoken as dead languages. Once the community of people who speak this language ceases to be, once this language is no longer in daily use, its very existence as an actual system of signification is viewed as something that had ceased to be. This points to the fact that as long as this language is indeed spoken, alive, it is in constant dynamic process of formation and reformation. The people who speak a certain language, its practitioners in the present, are also its applicators, its interpreters, and they as a community constantly shape and reshape it. The same is true of tradition. The practice of tradition means its interpretation. A living tradition is never set or frozen, but is rather a moving image of the past. Parts of tradition may wither and die, while others continue to move and flourish. This is Paul Rabinow's quote from 1975. To understand this, we must pay attention to the unique sense of knowledge upon which tradition is based. Practical knowledge, or traditional knowledge, which is quite different from the technical or formal knowledge that has come to dominate our sense of intelligence. Tradition lives in practice. It is experiential or intersubjective meaning. These are both Charles Taylor's phrases. It is not a formal articulation of our knowledge. This also addresses our attention to the institutional and organizational aspects of both language and tradition. Both have been the objects of attempts by sovereign powers, especially the modern nation state, and what we commonly refer to as religious authorities, to regulate the practice, and indeed, to regulate the very meaning, in some cases, of these systems of signification. The history of these attempts tell us both of the institutional power to influence the way we perceive and practice language or tradition, such as the standardization of national languages and the invention and forceful dissemination of national traditions, but also of their limit. The likening of tradition to language thus sheds light on the kind of relationship we, bearers of tradition or speakers of language, have with these socio-historical preconditions of our individuality. It brings to the fore both sides of the story, that we are forever captured in the web of meanings weaved by tradition, as manifested in our practice, our way of life, and that we, bearers of tradition, are also its interpreters, who not only maintain it, but also constantly reshape it. Let me move on to the second analogy or imagery of tradition as narrative. According to this analogy, which was developed most fully by Alistair MacIntyre, of course, tradition is quite simply our story. It is the historical and ever-developing narrative of which we, as individuals and communities, are a part. This can be a narrative of a certain practice or profession, of a certain ethnicity or nationhood, a certain religion, a certain moral philosophy, and so on. According to this view, every human institution has, or in a sense maybe even is, a narrative. And most critically, individuality and human agency are accordingly viewed as constituted by these social narratives. To quote MacIntyre, as he puts it brilliantly, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. We enter human society, that is, with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted, and we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. There is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through the stock of stories which constitute its initial dramatic resources. End of quote. This analogy embodies the interplay between change, development, and continuity in the clearest of senses. Again, to quote McIntyre, to be an adherent of a tradition is always to enact some further stage in the development of one's tradition. So our story is what enables us in the first place to comprehend reality and conduct ourselves in the world. The narrative that is tradition drafts us into a role whose basic features are already set. We don't choose this role, nor do we choose these constitutive features. But we are the ones who enact these roles. Each individual plays her various roles and, as in every case of play, interprets these roles and their features as she does so. It is not a coincidence that the concept of play or or game have such a decisive role in many philosophical works dealing with tradition. To understand this, we must first forsake rationalist notions of human subjectivity, according to which an independent human subject knows that she is just playing and reflects on the game while enacting it. Indeed, such a conscious acting or playing is a recipe for a manifestly worst performance. Indeed, we are dealing here with a mode of being, this is Gadamer's phrase, in a setting that seems to have a life of its own, but is nevertheless fundamentally dependent upon the actor or player in order to be. Without players or actors to perform it, play does not have an actual existence. And no two performances of the same play are identical. Every enactment is also an act of interpretation, an individual case of performance. Furthermore, these narratives are also open narratives. Their endings have yet to be written. Our interpretation of them are stages in their development, and these interpretations play a role in the determining of the future development of these narratives. In other words, traditions are dynamic. Which takes me to the third analogy of tradition as horizon. So this analogy is obviously derived from Hans-Georg Gadamer's work, and his suggestion that we understand the phenomena of interpretation and understanding in terms of horizons. This notion originates from a humble acknowledgement of our finitude, our situatedness, and most importantly, our historicity, as that which both enables our understanding in the first place and again constrains it. The horizon is that which captures both the potential for understanding and its limits. A horizon entails the totality of our understanding. It is everything I can see, meaning it is the full expanse of my potential understanding, and it is all that I can see, meaning the given limits of this understanding. Ecologically, tradition as horizon can be thus seen as forming the sum total of possible orientations an individual mind develops in certain situations at one point of time and place. From a more sociological point of view, if there is such a thing, they can be best understood as forms of life. What's more pressing is the fact that horizons, by definition, are dynamic. They change as we move around, as our situatedness develops. We can, and intelligent people usually aspire to do so, expand our horizons, in which case we will be able to see the previous limits of our understanding and what lies beyond it. But at the same time, still remember that our current situation also entails its own constraints on our understanding. Needless to say, we are also susceptible to the opposite, that is, of a narrowing of horizons, in which case we would become rather closed or narrow-minded. Any attempt to at detaching myself from my horizon, such as, for example, Descartes' initial exercise of liberating himself from what he has been taught to be true. This was the precondition of coming to grips with reality as it is, without the mediation of traditional knowledge, mainly through the rigid exercise of method. Any such exercise is futile. A mind without a horizon is not smarter than the one that is bound by its historicity. Rather, this so-called liberated mind is detached from any framework that would enable it to comprehend reality by way of ordering it. Without such meaning instilling horizons, making sense is just an impossibility. History and culture, in other words, are present in any encounter we have with reality, whether we acknowledge this or not. This view, carries a normative implication. Although tradition, history is in work, even if we do not acknowledge this much, we will be wrong to assume that we are exempt from acquiring an active knowledge of this tradition or history. In McIntyre's wording, having an adequate sense of tradition to which one belongs or which one confronts is a virtue. So let me ask the question and maybe try and answer it. What do these analogies point at? The view of tradition manifested in these three analogies has several implications for what I would call self-understanding, our self-understanding as rational or tradition-constituted agents. Let me sketch the very crude outlines of some of these more pressing implications. Epistemologically, the notion of tradition outlined here challenges the Enlightenment-born empiricist, positivist rationalism with its general disregard for tradition and its exclusive emphasis on abstract reason, on method, and on technical knowledge. Instead, this view of tradition highlights the essential role of practical reason, or traditional knowledge, or tacit knowledge. The list of names given to this kind of knowledge is almost endless. This amounts to a challenge against alleged antinomy between tradition and reason, highlighting instead the role of tradition and authority as constitutive elements of reason and of thought. At the same time, this view would stress tradition's dynamic nature and the role of the individual agent and of the relevant community in interpreting and maintaining tradition, arguing against conservative notions of tradition as rigid, eternal, and overtly authoritative. This challenge against Enlightenment notions of rationalism comes hand in hand with a heightened sensitivity to the role of practice. Tradition is realized only when it is comprehended, interpreted, loaded with meaning, internalized, and applied or practiced by its bearers. In other words, the practical understanding of tradition is a precondition of its existence. This cannot be a solely textual or, how would I say, virtual exercise. Given that the positivist rationalist epistemology has been the intellectual nurturing bed of the secularization thesis, the insistence on exposing the blind spots of this dominant epistemology, which is entailed in the understanding of tradition summarized here, can prove to be highly fruitful in facilitating a post-secular outlook. Crucially, this outlook would overcome the allegedly exclusive choice between, on the one hand, objectivism, realism, and truth, and on the other hand, relativism. It would view reality as entailing an ontological truth, one that can surely be the subject of discourse. But at the same time, it would stress the limited nature of our ability to grasp this truth. And the historical, the communal, and dynamic, that is, tradition-bound nature of our knowledge of this truth. This view of tradition also refutes the supposed antinomy between collective tradition and personal liberty, stressing instead that the very ability to conceptualize individuality and to view the self as an independent agent is itself dependent upon a constitutive tradition in which such a formulation is possible in the first place. Understanding tradition's constitutive role also sheds light on the nature and role of authority, highlighting it as a precondition for accumulating knowledge and for enabling us to reflect upon reality. I think for many of us holding roles in academia, this is an obvious feature that we not always reflect upon. Another central theme captured here is a careful assessment of tradition's developing and dynamic nature. Given its constitutive role, traditional change is relatively slow and it is gradual in nature. But we should nevertheless insist that since tradition lives only through the individual's and the community's practical interpretations of it, it is bound to change over time. This also opens up the potentiality for conflict in tradition and, in a wider historical time frame, also for contesting tradition altogether. Admittedly, this interpretation nevertheless leaves several matters unresolved. Primarily, I cannot argue to be offering a straightforward understanding of the way tradition is transmitted and appropriated. What exactly happened when I stand next to an experienced cook, for example, and watch her as her apprentice working and gaining my practical knowledge of cooking in a certain tradition? What is it that happens there? It's very difficult, or maybe even impossible to describe clearly. This indeed is one of the fundamental questions of the study of humanity, I think. And it touches upon our being social and historical. So beyond noting the obvious, that tradition is transmitted and appropriated, much like language and narrative, in its very practice, and only partially and often misleadingly, I should note, in the formal study of it as a codification, I suspect that it is one of the aspects of our humanity that evade clear articulation and formulation. It is not a coincidence that the philosophical works upon which my discussion is based all focus on an interpretation of the phenomena of tradition and do not pretend to offer a scientific explanation of the way tradition in actuality works and the way it is transmitted and appropriated. Similarly, it seems both urgent and ultimately futile to pin down the nature of the social power of tradition. This, I would say, simply is a matter of our humanity. Thank you.
If there are any pointed questions on details or specifications about the lecture, this is the time now. Yes, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. So one obvious point to note is that to conflate tradition with religion would be a mistake, because as I just noted, that traditions that I am thinking that I would want us to think about is obviously wider than what we call religion. The other lecture which I could have delivered when I was invited to speak in a panel on religion was to say why speaking of religion is a mistake. Why identifying religion as a suprahistorical and universal phenomena is a mistake. Why religion as we use it in contemporary language and translate it misleadingly to dat in Hebrew and din in Arabic or madhab in Arabic is a historically, politically value-laden, contextualized notion that is, again, confusingly and misleadingly being applied as if it is universal. So it is, I don't want to go into this, the very lengthy discussion of it, but I would just say that to view religion in the contemporary usage of the term as an authoritative attempt to capture tradition, to codify it, to enforce it, helps us see the problematics of tradition, of religion, of sorrow. But as I hinted at during my lecture, this would also imply to the dominant theology of our world, the theology of the nation state, that does exactly the same.